Good afternoon. How you doing? You doing all right? Fantastic. Well, it seems like I'm a long way away from you. You're okay out there? Fantastic. Now, in this subject, or in this session, we're going to be looking at how do we extend justice and faith in a multicultural community. We do recognize that we're living in a global village, don't we? Our world has changed. Our world has changed. Whether we like it or not, we need to accept the fact that the world we're living in has changed dramatically. But people, in terms of their values and perspectives, are still colored by the learnings that they've experienced. Can I share with you a story? Interesting story, because you know when God's going to do something incredible, there's always going to be some sort of level of persecution that takes place. There's always a challenge that's about to happen when you're about to do something. And before coming away this weekend and spending some time with you lovely people, challenges were happening left, right, and center. We're going, what is going on? In fact, my wife said to me, it may be easier if I just stayed home. You know that sort of a scenario? Well, we've got a next-door neighbor. Has anyone had problems with their next-door neighbors? You may be good, like... Oh, excellent. Oh, thank you. We've just moved into this new place, right? And we want to make good impressions on our neighbours. We've always had great relationship with people and neighbours. And I sort of consider myself as, you're a minister of the gospel. You bring good news and you're one that can bring peace and you can resolve problems. And you have these expectations on yourself, don't you? But what happens when your next door neighbour just doesn't want to get on with you? It's a problem, right? So when we first moved into our new place, there was some work that was supposed to be done by the last set of officers, and they said, no, we'll leave it for you to do. Officers don't do that, do they? So, they had to do some work around the house. There's some stuff that had to be happening, and one of the things was the kitchen had to be redone, and there was some things like that. The property guys had pre-allocated. So the guys measured the kitchen out, and you know what happened is the guys that measured the kitchen out measured the bench top incorrectly. Now, a bench top takes about 1 week to 2 weeks to cut. Now, you're going, why is he telling me this story? Well, I'm getting to the point, right? Hang in there with me. So what had happened was the bench top actually ended up taking 4 to 5 weeks to be sorted. And that meant we had to use our barbecue. Yeah, great. So we had to cook the barbecue. And what had happened was my next door neighbor, she complained that too much smoke was coming to her backyard. And then she complained that she didn't like barbecues, so she didn't like the smell of barbecues. Okay, listen, most Kiwis would agree with me, right? We love barbecues. It is a way of life. I'm thinking, what is wrong with this person? And so, and then the kids played cricket in the backyard, and the ball would go across into her yard, and she'd complain about that. And I'm thinking, she's complaining about everything. And just recently, she had something else to complain. But this is what happened. Our next door neighbor are Koreans, right? Koreans. And I love Korean people. I love Korean food. But this is what happened. The next day, when I was walking through the shopping center and a Korean lady approached me, guess what happened internally? Immediately, I went on the defensive. Immediately, something within my mind and something within my personhood got a little bit uptight. My confrontation with this Korean lady next door to me had colored the way I looked at the next Korean person I met. In fact, more than it colored, I was uneasy, and it colored the tone of my conversation with another lady who was totally different to the lady that lives next door to me. And that level of unconscious bias is in all of us, right? Whether we like it or not, I had to recognize that I had, in my mind and my experience, my lens had been colored with an unconscious bias, with can I be honest? Maybe a little racism, maybe a little discrimination. And you're thinking, how can that fellow over there, that coloured fellow there, be a bit racist? But true, we all have some level of prejudice. Sometimes we just don't realize it. But we all do. Not that you're better than anyone else or you're more racist. We all have this disposition to be a little bit prejudiced because of our experiences and what I've experienced. And whether it's my next door neighbor or some shop assistant that was rude to you or some person behind a government desk that was a bit difficult, it then colors the way you think about people. You with me? Recognizing that helped me to realize that in the world we live in, we can treat people, we can be the church, but treat people with injustice. Because sometimes the experiences we've had has colored our lenses. So the question, how do I extend faith and justice in a growing global village when I carry some of these prejudices that I didn't realize I even carried? You know, the first step to this journey is we need to acknowledge what's happening for us. And I want to tell you that the church has been guilty of the same issue for a long, long time. The church has been guilty of its own level of prejudice, its own level of discrimination because of the world we've lived in. I'll tell you the Auburn story. It's a corps where my wife and I were corps officers for 10 years. And for those who were in the first session, I may repeat a few things, right? But are you okay to listen to them a second time? Who was in the first session? Oh, there's a few of you. Okay. So when we arrived, it was the appointment that we arrived before we actually went to training college. Why? Because they couldn't find anyone to go there. You got to love those appointments, don't you? They're the best appointments. No one wanted to go there. In fact, what was happening was every 18 months to 2 years, there was a change of officer. And there was a change of officer because the Salvation Army had deemed that this part or this community was so Muslim orientated, it felt that the Salvation Army or the work of the Salvation Army would not actually succeed. Don't you love it when people tell you something is too hard to do? I love it when people say it's too hard because you know what? When it's too hard for us to do, it's possible for God to do. Elizabeth had the same problem. Remember the story? Elizabeth, old in age, husband Abraham, even older. And God says to Abraham and Elizabeth, you're going to be fruitful and you're going to bear a child. What did she do? She laughed. She laughed. She laughed and she said, Sarah laughed and she said, how can my God do this for me? I said Elizabeth, but I meant Sarah. Thank you. Sarah said, how can in my old age can I have a child? And the angel said to her, is there anything too hard for God? Is there anything too hard for God? And I think sometimes when the ground is hard and the situation is difficult, we ask the question, it's too hard. God, send someone else. Moses says, send someone else, Lord, too hard. And we put things in the too hard basket. And the Auburn story was we arrived in a corps where numbers were declining and the situation was getting worse. And people said it's too hard. In fact, some of the faithful leaders that had been there said it was too hard. But what was happening around us was there was a growing global village. And that village was getting larger and larger and larger. yet we didn't know how to connect with the global village yet. Oh. There's nothing. Was that the only page I had? Oh, here we go. I want to show you this story. Oh. No volume. We'll come back to it. But in 2005, there was a major riots where two young Muslim boys from Auburn went to Cronulla and they picked on a lifeguard. And as a consequence of that, a racial undercurrent pervaded to the point where we saw some of those images on our television screens and thought, is this Australia? A couple of years later, 2008, London riots took place. Once again, racial undertones came to the surface. Incredible amounts of racial tensions was building globally. Our then Prime Minister John Howard said, Australia is not a racist country, but he was kidding himself. We can say that racism doesn't exist, but I'm a racist, and I'm trying to deal with it. We have discrimination. It's rife in all parts of our world and our society. But I believe God has something to say about this, doesn't he? And he has something to challenge us about how we think about that. How do we live missionally when racial tensions are building around us? So I can tell you what we started to do as thank you guys, excellent. So one of the things we started to do was we realized that the tension was getting out of hand. The police said, and you know the interesting thing is, when situations are so difficult like what we saw in 2005 with the Cronulla riots and what we saw in Auburn and surrounding suburbs, police and government had no answers. Because they don't have the answers that we have. Because the church is the hope of the world. And we have the answers. So we started building a scenario where we would meet with Islamic leaders and Christian leaders and fuse them together. And we started marching through the streets every New Year's Eve. And what we started to do was we're trying to say to the young people, there's a different way to express your anger. There's a different way to express the things that are happening for you. And we started to build a process to help people become missionally renewed. And so one of the strategies, and I want to share with you 5 simple strategies here today. You ready? The first journey, or the first point for us to bring justice and faith is personal renewal. Because it starts with me. I am the first part of this. It has to start with me. Before your church, before your community becomes renewed and restored, I need to renew myself. Personal renewal is about allowing the Spirit of God to come into me. It's like the psalmist says, search me, O Lord, and reveal to me, Lord, the things that are hidden within me. I need to understand the things that are hidden within my spirit, within my mind, within my heart. The things that I don't seem to see in the natural, but God can see in the spiritual. And God needs to reveal to me the things in my life. Personal renewal is the first part of this process. I need to go through a journey of personal renewal. The second thing is relational renewal. My relationships need to be renewed. The broken relationship I have with my next door neighbor needs to be renewed. You know, some people, we read the words of God and God says, "Revengeance is mine, says the Lord." But I think when we read it, we go, "Revengeance is mine, says the Lord." Did you get it? Instead of it being God's, it becomes mine. I need to get squared. I need to get even with this person. But I need to be the one that brings relational renewal. I need to make it right with the relationships around me. I need to make it right with the relationships in my own family. And then the third is missional renewal. And that's when the church begins to align itself with the principles of God. Because we as a church are broken people. And because we're broken, we have people who are full of prejudice and discrimination. We don't beat them up. I've learnt. You know my first thing? I used to beat people up. And it doesn't work. Being holy and righteous, it doesn't work. It doesn't really work at all. I was sitting in the back of Congress Hall one Sunday with my son Josh. He was 3 at the time, and Rod and Jenny were the core officers. I think Rod was preaching that Sunday. He was, like he does, brings a powerful word. And my son Josh is sitting on my knee at the time. He's 3, and he looks into my face. And I think it's one of those beautiful father and son moments. And he looks into my eyes and says, "Dad," I think he's going to say something just so profound. So I'm all ears. I'm leaning in. He says, "Dad." I said, "Yes, Josh." He goes, "Do you realize you're black?" So I looked at him. I go, "No." What happened? See, at 3 years of age, he had just discovered that I was different. See, his mum's white. She comes from England. She speaks with an accent. No, she doesn't. But he just realized that I was different. And you know what? There are times when people in the church realize that other people are different. And they don't know how to deal with our differences. And sometimes our differences can cause rifts. We think differently. We speak differently. We have different values. We have different things that are important for us. I remember when Muslim people started coming to our church, it was really, really exciting. But some of our other folk found that really hard to take. In fact, I had one lady say to me, "Listen, I'll tell you another story. You want to hear another story? Mrs. Blackley, unfortunate last name. Mrs. Blackley was a lovely lady, and she was in our congregation, and I would go and visit her and meet with her. And Cheryl was at the front door, and so was I. Cheryl was a bit further along because it was a tight hallway, so we spread ourselves out. And Mrs. Blackley says to me, she says, "Nesan, I've decided that I'm not coming to this church anymore." "Oh, Mrs. Blackley, I'm sad to hear that. Why? Why aren't you coming anymore?" She said, "Well, haven't you realized? There's too many black people in this church now." Now, Cheryl was literally 3 feet away from me. I'm thinking, "But Mrs. Blackley, I'm black." I didn't say it. I just thought it. And it dawned on me. Mrs. Blackley didn't realize that I was different to her. She just saw me as her church pastor, Nesan. And she loved me, and she enjoyed spending time with me. But the challenge was that she didn't like the people were yet to know and build relationship with. And part of missional renewal in the church needs to help people change their heart. Now, I love what Paul was saying in the first session, but let me say to you what I believe is important in this journey. We often want to change people's behavior. That is racist. You can't say that. You can't act that way. You can't do what you're doing. And you know what? That helps no one. It doesn't help you. It doesn't help them. What I learned and what God started impressing upon my heart is we got to start even more basing that. We got to start to change the way we speak. We got to speak a love language that connects people. And we've got to help people discover a new language to express themselves. It's not that people naturally want to be racist. Majority of people don't. They don't want to be discriminatory. They don't want to be prejudiced. They don't want to have this unconscious bias. But they haven't yet learned a framework to express what they're thinking. So we need to create an opportunity and space for where people can learn how to reframe their story. I felt this way when I experienced that. That led me to this conclusion because of that journey, because of that experience. That requires missional renewal. The other part of this journey is, as part of the missional renewal, is to help people, once you start to speak differently, you start to think differently. Language, thinking, then behavior starts to shift. I think too often we're in a hurry, friends. But I want to say to you, the process is important. Hence why the first step is personal renewal. Then relational renewal before you get to missional renewal. We want to bring missional renewal before we've allowed people to change within their own hearts and minds and allow God the Holy Spirit to do that. And allow people to journey in their relationships. Then the fourth thing, and the other thing about missional renewal, I'll get to it. The fourth thing is cultural renewal. Before we start focusing on the cultures, we need to focus on the kingdom culture. It's when the kingdom culture becomes the central prevailing culture that the cultures around us start to accentuate, and we see the beautifulness of it, and we see the grace in it and the richness of it. Because cultures are beautiful. I love the Maori culture. I think it's one of the most beautiful cultures in the world. I love the Polynesian cultures. I love the African cultures. I love the Indian cultures. I love all cultures. But when God's kingdom culture sits at the center, and that doesn't mean those cultures become less. No, my friends, it doesn't. It means that those cultures are given an avenue to express themselves under the banner of God. Now, we can do a whole workshop on just that, but Rod will be kicking me off the stage by then. But cultural renewal, when God renews the culture of the church, we see something significantly takes place. The fifth thing is structural renewal. After your church has gone through the first 4 renewals, it's going to outgrow its current situation. You know what I love about structural renewal? It's not comes first. Often we want to make structural renewal first. We want to change structures and functions, and then expect that will naturally give light to all the other things we want to see happen. Structural renewal happens last. And often it needs to be an expression of what God's already doing. But when we do structural renewal, we need to align it. And I say often, there's a couple key things that challenge us the most. Money is one of the biggest issues in churches finding structural renewal. Where you put your money, where you align your money, is where the core or your mission or your ministry is going to head. And if you put your money in mission, and the right sort of mission, then you will see fruit emerge. You with me so far? Often we're putting our finances in the wrong areas. The other thing is, and this is where it gets challenging, leadership. Structural renewal also leads to leadership renewal. How we change the way we appoint leaders. And I'm not just talking about how THQ and DHQ. I'm talking about how we as core ministries, and we're talking about how we as small community groups, how we put the right person in the right role. If we don't allow ourselves to put, so when I talk about it, it's interesting. The Auburn journey was, oh, thank you, someone's moving the slides for me. Excellent, thanks guys. Isn't that a great photo of my wife over there? One of the things we started to realize, it's beautiful, yeah, I'll put it in. She's a good-looking lady. One of the things we noticed that when we started to see that we started this renewal process, God started sending us some really amazing people. And one of the biggest challenges, and I think this is one of the greatest injustices in the church, is when new people start to come into your faith community, often we say things like, it's great that God is blessing us with great new people. Amen? Yeah, you with me? But we don't want these new people to change the way we do things around here. Oh, we don't want these new people starting to influence the way we talk and the way we behave. Oh, no, we can't do that. But I want to tell you that if you want to grow and you want to be a faith community that ministers in terms of culture, we needed to prevail into every spectrum. And the hardest thing that we experienced as core officers in Auburn was when we said to the spiritual elders and the leaders of the church, those on the core council, you know what? Some of you may need to step down to allow opportunity for the next wave of what God wants to do. You know what? We were fine. Everyone was fine. Great, the growth's happening, the finances are going up. We're doing some great evangelism. The community's changing. That was one of the toughest part of the journey. But I want to say to you, friends, that if we don't take that step, we limit what God does next. So what we started to see was when we started to push into that space, we saw some great leaders emerge. And we saw some really spiritually humble leaders did what Barnabas did for Paul. I need to be your encourager and release you. I need to be your encourager and groom you and let you move forward. And we started to see that start to change. And when we started to see that change, we saw guys like Edward step up. Edward Conter. This young man had ability and talent that was phenomenal. And he started taking me. What we started to do, we were running this International Sunday service. Once a year, we ran an International Sunday. And what we saw at the International Sunday, we saw more than 80 different countries come and join us for worship and ministry. On the first Sunday we did that, we had a hall that could only, at that stage we moved into a new building, could only cater for 550 people. Now my wife is really, really strict on occupational health and safety and on following the rules and regulations. Well, she's not that strict these days. I've bended her arm a little bit. But that Sunday, we had over 900 people in our building. What was exciting about that was we started to see the world come in, the global world come in, and worship in such different ways than we're used to. Now, I heard you had a little bit of that flavor last night. I'm so sorry I missed it. I should have jumped on an earlier plane. But when you see that start to happen, it starts to change people's thinking and language. Do you see what I'm saying? We need to create intentional steps for people to think differently and speak differently because they experience different things. And when that starts to happen, our whole circle starts to change. So we started to see that, and basically we started to see the International Sunday become a beautiful expression of God's grace. The other thing that started to happen was we started to run a program for refugees and asylum seekers. You know, whenever you talk about refugees and asylum seekers, people look at you strangely. People start to say to you, why are you promoting things for people that are queue jumpers, economic migrants? You've heard all the names. Boat people. I want to tell you one of the incredible things that started happening was we had a gentleman turn up. We were going to hand coats out to homeless to some of our guys, the refugees who were living in tough situations. They were homeless, but homeless in the sense that they were living in people's homes, on lounges and living rooms, and they didn't have blankets, and they didn't have bedding, they didn't have all the natural things. And so we started a partnership with this organisation, and I had to go to another function, so I left Cheryl there. Maybe I should get her to tell the story. Do you want to come up here quickly and tell the story? Because this will be great. Come on up. You want to hear from her, don't you? Yeah. Come up and share the story. So it just so happened that I had to go somewhere else to do something different. And this guy was a very, very successful business guy, and he was very hard-nosed in terms of what he wanted to do. And then, why don't you talk about what's...
Hello. The fellow was from the Order of St. John, and that's a group of successful businessmen that meet, and they do acts of charity across communities. And so this fellow's name was Jean-Pierre, and he said he turned up to this dinner, and which we had about 90 asylum seekers, and he says, I'm not giving these people these coats. And I said, well, we've got all these people here, there's going to be a bit of a riot. And he said, no, they're for homeless people. And I said, well, how do you define homeless? And he said, oh, someone who's sleeping on the streets, rah-de-rah-de-rah. And I said, well, these guys are homeless in another way. I said, you've come all this way, why don't you at least have dinner with us, and I'll allow some of the guys to share the story. And he said, yeah, I'd be happy to listen to their story, but I'm not giving them coats. And I said, that's okay, that's fine. So we sat at a dinner table together, and he refused to eat. And the first man stood up, and he was a man from Sri Lanka. And he'd been on a boat, and he talked about his family and how he'd come, and how his printing press had been burnt down, and how he'd been beaten up by the government because he'd printed anti-government slogans. So he was sent to a prison, he escaped from prison, and he jumped on a boat and came to Australia. And then the next man stood up, and he talked about his story, and the guy leans across and he said, I'll give those 2 coats, but I'm not giving them to anybody else. And so then another man stood up. And then an Iranian man stood up who has children the same age as my children, and he spoke about how he came on a boat with his wife and his 6-month-old daughter and his 6-year-old son. And how they were fleeing persecution because his brother had been beaten up, and how the government was coming for them, and how they put their baby in a boat and went to Christmas Island, and how they became Christians, and then how they were released into community detention in Australia, and how the Salvation Army had helped them. And this man just looked at me and he said, I'll give 15 coats. I said, that's great. 15's better than none, but we've got, 90 people here. And he goes, no. And the story just kept continuing. And then at the end he said, I'll give everybody a coat. I'll just give everybody a coat. And then he gave out the coats, and he actually shook hands with every single person and made eye contact with them, and tears were streaming down his face. And everybody left, and I was supposed to be going into a worship rehearsal, and I sat down with him, and he said to me, God's really done something in my heart tonight. I said, oh, really? He goes, I was very angry with you when I arrived, but you know what? I have seen the truth. So often we believe what the media tells us. He said, but these are real people with real stories. And he goes, I'm a Catholic and I believe in God. He said, but this is the first time that God has actually made an impact in my life. And he grilled me for 45 minutes. But just amazing what God does when you just allow yourself, and I didn't feel equipped to talk to this man. I said to Nesan afterwards, this is your gig. You're really good with people. You left me in such a difficult space, but God just intervenes and he does the most amazing things.
Yeah, that's good, isn't it? It's a great story. And if you look at the second photo, that's the 90-odd guys and ladies that were waiting to get their coats. And the amazing thing was, and what Cheryl didn't add in, is that John Pierre has been coming back every year since. And not only has he done that, he has made a personal financial contribution to the mission and the ministry of the Salvation Army in that space. And he's generous. He's a banker. So he's a very wealthy, it's not a commercial banker. It's not a normal, So what did you say? It's his own bank. So he's a very, very, and we didn't know this, very wealthy, influential guy. Hard-nosed business guy that looked at everything with, dots all the I's, crosses all the T's. And he said, now that even since we've left, he still keeps in contact with Cheryl and says, listen, what can I do more? How can I help more? Because refugees and asylum seekers, in his mind originally, was a no-no. But you see, when personal renewal happens, when relational renewal happens, missional renewal takes place. You with me? And that's a practice. The third thing was our suicide awareness campaign. In every city, there's injustice. And we found that migrant families, we found that suicide was tabooed. The biggest challenge they found was that when someone committed suicide, no one would pay for the funeral. And the numbers of suicide in a calendar year was getting ridiculous. Now, you know the salvos. People are asking us to do all sorts of things. And I got tired of just trying to fundraise to pay for suicide funerals and burials. So I went to the state member and I said, we've got to do something. So we started an awareness campaign to deal with suicide. Now, we invited everyone in the community to come along, and we had a community forum at a local primary school. I got up, I gave a bit of a spiel about what we wanted to do in a vision, and I thought, you know what, maybe 30 people will turn up. You wouldn't believe it. Over 150 people turned up to a community gathering. We had local imams turn up. We had school principals turn up. We had sporting community leaders turn up. We had people from all parts of the world turn up. The community turn up. And the local imam stood up in the middle of the gathering. He was a big guy, and he said, listen, everyone, stop talking. He said, you know what? We need the Salvation Army to do this, to lead us. We don't know how to do it, but we need you guys to help us do it. And for the next hour and a half, people shared their stories of family members that have tried to commit suicide and not knowing how to respond. We started a walk on 9/11, September 9th of September, on the 11th day. And it was a poignant moment because of what happened in the USA. And especially since Auburn was such an Islamic-centric community. We had, I don't think that picture's big enough, unfortunately, but we had the head of the local imam, cleric, turn up, walk with us. We had all religious leaders in the community turn up, walk with us. We had police. We had all the civic leaders turn up. And then we had a stream of 400 people walk down the main streets of Auburn on a Thursday night, walking. And guess what the sign says? Walking for hope. We were starting to see missional renewal take place in our city because we started to say, you know what, the church is the hope of the world. We are the ones that to lead the light, to lead hope, to change the city. It's not going to happen because our politicians decide to do it. It's not going to happen because great community leaders want it. It is the church that needs to lead the way of justice. Yeah? And we started to see a whole new change. Local media got on board. In fact, it got so popular that the New South Wales Commissioner for Police asked if he could come. We didn't have to invite him. He wanted to come. In fact, that was starting to happen. We had federal members of state government and federal government say to us, can we come to your event? Don't you know when God is starting to do something incredible, you don't need to push the wheelbarrow up the hill. You got to try and catch the handles while it's flying down the hill. In fact, things started to speed so fast and so out of control. We had Hospitality companies started to knock on our door and say, listen, we want to come and partner with you. So they were starting to run our kitchen. What I want to try to say to you is, we often try and change behavior. But God says, I want to change the way you think. And I want to change the language you use. And then let me transform people's lives and hearts. One of the I'm running out of time, right? I can keep going. Can I tell you another story? Is that all right? You okay so far? Everyone okay? We had a gentleman that sang in our staff songsters. So he sang in the staff songsters, he played in the band, he was, one of those guys that, when I first arrived at the Corps, came up to me, he goes, don't you try anything? One of those sort of guys. You know what I'm talking about? He complained about everything. Not as bad as my next door neighbor, but he complained. The worship team was too loud and this was an issue and that. But one day, an African lady came up to him. And she said to him and his wife, she said, I'm about to have a child. But in our culture, in our tradition, the eldest statesman of the church, we asked to be the godfather and the godmother. Would you give us the honor? He looked. He thought, what's going on here? So Saturday morning, 3 a.m., Brian gets a call from the hospital. I want to tell you, you're going to be a godfather to a son. And he was so excited. He came up to me and said, this was the best thing that's ever happened in my life. He was in the leadership of the church, the Corps, and he said to me, he stood up in front of the leadership team. He said, I used to love this Corps for all the wrong reasons. But I'm going to tell all of you people right here today, and you're speaking to the leadership team, that I love this Corps now for the right reason. God had changed his heart and changed his behavior. Not because of my clever words or because I try to push him. Because we had seen personal renewal, relational renewal, missional renewal, cultural renewal. And the structure of our Corps started to change. God can do it, can't he, friends? God wants to administer, just as Micah 6:8 says. We are to walk, we are to act justly. Walk humbly, act justly. That's what we're called to do, aren't we? And that's what has been the mission and the heartbeat of the Salvation Army from its very origin, from the very conception with William Booth. We are to go where there's the poorest, the most marginalized, where there's indiscrimination, where there's injustice. That's what we have to fight for. If we don't, who will? Well, friends, God bless you. It's been great sharing with you today. We've run out of time. I'm sorry. I'd love to speak to you. I mean, I've got a whole string of stories. You want to hear one more quick story? I'm going to tell you the story because I promised the guys I was going to tell them the story in the previous and I didn't tell them. It's the story of Johari. Because Johari changed the destiny of our core mission. Because we were green as anything and we hadn't a lot of knowledge of how to deal with this cultural diversity gap that we're facing. But Johari was a lady that was difficult to work with. And the ladies that were dealing welfare couldn't handle her. So I got appointed to take her to all her medical appointments. And I would drive her to the doctors, drop her home. She never said thank you once. So ungrateful. You know, she'd say, we don't have enough blankets, so I'd go and get some blankets and take blankets over. A heater would break, and then I'd go and get a heater and buy a heater and take a heater to her. Yeah, and never once did she say thank you. In fact, my wife said to me, listen, I think she's taking advantage of you. I think you're a bit of a soft touch. She rings you up, you're like her taxi service on call. I'm ready to be picked up now. So I'd drive over, pick her up, and take her home. You know, the things we do. So one Saturday morning, it was early, it was like before 6 a.m. We're still asleep. Johari rings on the mobile, and my wife says, "Don't answer it." I said, "No, I'll answer it." So I answered the phone. Johari says to me, "Pastor, you need to come immediately to my house." She spoke like that. I'm thinking, well, Johari, it's like Saturday morning. I won't say again. You need to come immediately to my house. I don't know. But God was saying to me, this is the right thing to do, go. So I got dressed. I get to her house, park the car, and there's no parking nearby because there's so many cars on the street. So I had to walk. Knock on the front door. There's a young man from our church there, Abedi, between moi. He goes, "Pastor, Johari's in bed." I'm thinking, she's still in bed? Seriously? So I walk into her bedroom. She's in bed. She said, "Pastor, come here." She said, "Pastor, last night I had a dream." I said, "Nice." I was having a dream. And in my dream, I saw a man. And he said to me, "Do you know who I am?" She goes, "I know that face. I know that face. But I don't know who you are." And he said to her again, she said to me, "Do you know who I am?" She said, "Yes, I know who you are. You're Jesus." And Johari said, "He said to me, I've been waiting for you." She said, "So Pastor, now I'm ready to get saved." So I led her to salvation. Acknowledge who He is. That He loved you while you were still living a life that wasn't right. That He's forgiven your sins. And she said, "Yes, I accept Him as my Lord and Savior." But you know what? The story doesn't end there. She said, "Now you can go and stand there." And she summoned all of her 9 children into her bedroom. And she led them to Christ one by one. Except for one. The eldest's name was Chance. She says, "Mom, we're Muslim. We can't become Christians. This is wrong." But 8 of her children that day got saved. We never stopped praying for Chance. 6 months later, she came to church and she said to me, she walked in as we finished and we called the altar call. We have an altar call every Sunday. And I want to tell you, the place is always full. People say, "What's wrong with your church? It's full of sinners." I go, "Yep." And people kept coming. And I want to tell you, the altar was a place where people always came in the Salvation Army. Over and over and over again. And you know what? People never stopped coming. I think sometimes our pride prevents us from coming to the place of prayer. And Chance came with her mother and many others. And she gave her life to the Lord that day. Johari taught me that Muslims can get saved. Amen. God bless you.